Okay.
Welcome to today's webinar, The Last Commons, Chapter 3. The chapter is entitled The Illusion of Permanence. It'll be a discussion of the blinding impact of sustained prosperity, bringing forth our panel, which I'll be introducing shortly. But before doing so, I'm going to be asking ARCOS, our AI agent, or the KEI Networks agent, if it'll bring us up to date on what we've learned so far through the first three chapters. So, ARCOS, can you bring us up to date on what we learned so far?
Of course. So far, we've learned that sustained prosperity can create a false sense of security, leading societies to believe that current conditions will last indefinitely. This illusion of permanence makes us overlook underlying vulnerabilities. Alberta's reliance on energy resources, for instance, fostered confidence, but also hid structural fragilities that only surfaced during economic downturns. Each chapter has highlighted the cost of ignoring these uncomfortable truths, showing that resilience is tested when conditions change. Moreover, the rapid advance of AI challenges the notion that knowledge and professional expertise will always be the foundation of economic value. In essence, we're learning that true resilience requires recognizing these warning signs and adapting before it's too late.
Thank you, Arcos. That was an excellent update. Okay, so with that having been used as an introduction, I'm going to introduce the panel. Our special guest, although he's no stranger to any of us, is Bill Jones. And for those of you that haven't met Bill before, Bill's background is extraordinary. He's been an international consultant, spent several years in the Caribbean, an economist and a computer scientist. That's quite a combination. And certainly a champion of the relevance of data centers as our new universities and churches of the future. And then Don Ringrose, again, no introduction really necessary, but Don, when I think about you, I think about organizational excellence through money, marketing, management, manpower, metrics, and mentors. And I welcome you again. And Jeff, of course, co-editor with me on the book, worked with me for several years at KPMG with a background in human resource management, then went off into the world of the Middle East and spent time in higher education as a human resource management consultant. And then Haley Commons, I've done that before. Haley, I just don't know where that comes from. Haley Simons, extraordinary breadth of interests that range from the impact of artificial intelligence on the profession of law to a founder of the Alberta Creativity Network and sits on the National Creativity Association in the United States, and also interest in the future of work as perceived by youth. So she brings arts and science together. So it's quite a panel, diverse interests, and I've got a few questions I'd like to pose about the topic of today, which is, of course, the illusion of permanence. And I'm going to start out with you, Haley. The newsletter opened with the provocative idea that stability may be a warning, not a strength. Where, in your perspective, are we mistaking continuity for resilience, and what signals might we already be ignoring that should be apparent today?
I kind of love and hate being the first person answering this on your panel, Perry. What a great discussion. And also thanks for including me in this again, because the breadth and the depth of that question, when you start to draw some of the nuances out, it's not nuanced, and the timing feels exceptionally relevant and exceptionally uncomfortable, because it's exactly the kind of question that keeps me up at night. I think maybe other people as well, not just intellectual curiosity or a sleep disorder. I don't know. Perry, you call it, it's prosperity as blindfold, and it's probably the right mechanism to name, because what you're describing, it's not ignorance and it's not incompetence, and the signals were there. And of course we have hindsight, and goodness, if only there was some historical perspective or some story where this happened before, and we could learn from that. Gee, if only. The stories where comfort became stronger than the signal. And I mean, right back from Joseph reading Pharaoh's dream, right? Whether you take it literally or not, it's one of humanity's oldest recorded arguments, reading pattern over moment. And I'm sure maybe we can go through the whole panel and name our favorite historical events that illuminate exactly this conversation. Pulling it back to the prosperity, and I know you all love to talk about economics, and Alan Greenspan sitting in front of Congress in 2008 and admitting he'd found, paraphrasing, a flaw in his model because he had assumed rational self-interest would self-correct magically. It didn't. Exactly because the prosperity was too comfortable to question. And then you all in Alberta, if only you didn't have somebody like Peter Lougheed who saw something like this coming. And maybe that's, I don't know, is it too soon? Is it a little bit of a trigger? Heritage Fund wasn't a nice idea. It was a deliberate civilizational foresight. And it was Lougheed essentially saying, this will not last. And we need to build for a day when it doesn't. And what could possibly go wrong? And then the successive governments, what did they do with the vision? And they treat it like a piggy bank during good years, and it becomes a political football during the bad ones. And the signals were there. They were there. Nobody was blind to them. Blindfold becomes a choice. And the architecture for responding was literally already built, and comfort won anyway. So this is where, and Perry, you and I have had these casual brain psychological conversations, and it has that layer, and maybe it resonates, the Einstellung effect, that tendency for a prior successful solution to literally block recognition of a better one because your brain stops generating alternatives. And this is where, and I know you started out our individual perspectives, but this is my insertion point for the all-important, absolute fundamental development of imagination and creativity. So that's my insertion point. We talk about a cognitive load, sustained questioning, and is this still true? If something is going right, we must be able to imagine the time when it doesn't go right. And that's a human trait. How do we circumvent that human trait? I'm interested to hear what everybody else says.
It's particularly interesting that you cite Lougheed's Heritage Trust Fund, because it wasn't introduced so much in an assumption that oil may never exist again, but to create sufficient diversity in order to handle the volatility and the cycles. It was meant to give the province a form of resilience so that it could weather those. Sooner or later, of course, it will be gone, but in the meantime, that volatility was extreme, and this was a way to level it out. So I'm going to put that aside and jump to our guest today. So Bill, I'm going to ask you to zero in on the Alberta pattern. Is it a local case? Is there something to be learned on a global scale? Alberta is presented not so much as an exception in the book, but as an early signal of a broader pattern of global relevance where prosperity masks fragility. Do you see similar dynamics emerging in other sectors or regions today, particularly in the knowledge economy?
Exactly, Perry. Alberta's not a local case. It's more of a prototype. Whenever a system builds around a dominant advantage, it stops adapting to anything outside of it. And so in Alberta, it's our oil industry and hydrocarbons, but today it's AI and the knowledge work. So we have the same fundamentals. We have institutions that optimize for stability, credential systems optimize or not undermining, but hiding capability and performance based on that looks strong but is very fragile. So when we have a collapse of the knowledge economy, we're misreading continuity with resilience. And so it isn't that AI is dangerous. That's a mixed diagnosis, I believe. The real risk is institutional and cognitive over-reliance on assumptions about human value. And AI is not disrupting, but exposing that underlying flaw. So it's exposing what's already fragile. So now, because of the collapse of the knowledge economy, where we had gatekeepers to knowledge, and they locked that up, and that implied wisdom. But knowledge is not wisdom. Knowledge is consequence, decision making, and then accepting the consequences of those decisions. And we've misaligned that. And AI being disruptive is simply exposing that fragility between those two concepts.
Fascinating. So we're not alone. On a global scale, many are being defensive, and it's interesting. I can personally account for how many instances in strategic planning, working with an organization, and when we talk about change, found them getting defensive about a low probability, high impact event that only sat on the horizon. And that defensiveness was an indication of they didn't feel resilient of being able to handle change. Okay, third one, Dawn. This one is about the relational deficit. The research suggests that access to capital is not the primary constraint. Coordination, management, relationships are. Why do you think systems consistently overinvest in funding while underinvesting in relational capacity? And how do we correct that imbalance?
Well, I think that funding is visible and measurable, and it provides inputs. You know, we've got money, we've got programs, and that's easier for people to think about. But it's more difficult to think about relationships because they're intangible and hard to quantify. And when you think about things like collaboration and capability and results, those are more on the outcome side of things. And if we take a look at high performing organizations and we take a look at excellence models, you're going to see a fair bit of relational practices. And so they're investing in leadership capabilities, the stakeholder engagement, cross-functional collaboration, and process integration. You know, so it's really taking all of those resources and all of those stakeholders and taking a look at the big system and the impact of internal and external forces. So it's I think if we had better management systems in our organizations, that we'd be better able to utilize the capital.
So many of our management systems seem to be ruled or dominated by the relevance of the accountant. And the one thing the accountant measures is, of course, the dollar, which is easy to move around and easy to measure. But accountants are highly risk averse. They're not the people you want to, you might have them at the steering wheel, but you certainly don't want to have them on the headlights. So I know in my work with accountants, they don't trust sales or marketing in the least, which is usually you're more forward looking and client relevant. So accountants are also not likely to be strong in their relational skills. They're not relational in the sense of network builders. They measure the shekels. And here we are, recognizing that the future is probably more about relationships than it is about dollars. So thank you, Dawn. Okay, last but not least, Jeff, institutional resistance to change. You and I talk about this all the time. The article argues that institutions are structurally designed to preserve stability, maintain the status quo, even when adaptation is required. Is this a failure of leadership, incentives, or design? And what would it take to build institutions that can adapt without losing coherence?
I was going to say that I've been part of many organizations over my working career that were in a period of transformation, that were in need of responding to some major outside influence. Um, so I've seen that resistance firsthand. And I always, you think you put responsibility on leadership in many cases, but then I've also thought that this is a feature, not a bug, this resistance. Organizations are built to be resilient. They're built to withstand pressure from outside. I have left organizations in the past thinking, this is such a mess. This place is just going to fall apart without me. And it never did. They are still around. They're bumbling along, and they're doing okay. And I look back on some of them and I think, I can't believe that that place is still operating, and it still is 20 years later. My dad used to have a saying when he left a job many years ago. He said, put your hand in a bucket of water, and when you pull it out, that gives you an idea of the hole that you leave when you leave an organization, right? It is self-correcting. It is self-reinforcing. It fills the gap, and it prevails. I think that leadership has a hard time overcoming the structural nature of organizations and also the incentives that are in place. And I think leadership is really hard. If you're in an organization, if you're in the CEO suite or in the C-suite, and I've worked with several CEOs who were trying to move forward with some major initiative. It's really tough. And you're dealing with the patience of a wide range of stakeholders. They have a board that might get impatient with them or might respond to feedback or pressure from outside. They have stakeholders that are in the organization, employees, they have vendors, they have all of these different parties that are impinging on their ability to do and to see it through. I worked with a consultant years ago who was part of the CN rail transformation. And he had an example that stuck with me for 30 years. He said, as he was working and supporting that change, he said, imagine that you are moving a step forward at a time and you have this harness on your back. And attached to that harness is this gigantic elastic band. And every step you take forward increases the tension on that elastic band. And as that tension increases, a misstep will snap you back to a position before where you started. And that's the nature of an organizational change effort. The pressure that is created by moving in that new direction is intense, and it's really hard. And I've seen more of those big efforts fail than I've seen them succeed because of those pressures. So I think it's institutional resistance is a design problem. And I think it's easy to blame leadership sometimes, but there's also some structural and incentive aspects that have to be considered as well. And so the opposite of that rigidity, some people might say, well, we have to disrupt, we have to break things. That's the way that we can unseat this entrenched practice. And that's got some dangers in itself, of its own. And I think we see evidence of that in the world and in organizations as well. You can swing the pendulum too far to the other side. And so I think it's similar to the protection that Bill mentioned, and I think you've mentioned, Perry, in terms of how professions protect themselves even against masking what might be incompetence or irrelevance. But they mistake their mission and their methods, and I think that's a problem. And the successful leaders are the ones that can be truth tellers, who can recognize the reality of the situation and the circumstances they face, and can articulate it in such a way that they can get the buy-in from both above and below. We talked about this the other day, Perry. It's got to be bottom up, and it's got to be top down, and it's not pure top down and it's not pure bottom up. And so it's that navigation of that minefield that is the big challenge.
Well, that top to bottom metaphor is quite relevant when structure becomes one of the impediments, when you've got a hierarchy that has so many layers to it that the influence of leadership is almost non-existent. We think of leadership as having influence over individuals, which is where the relational skills come in. Not so much about the material issues, but more about the processes that human beings navigate. But if leadership can't shape that organization, because there's so much hierarchy to it, and I think about the health system, I think of many organizations that over time have continued to hire and hire and hire and layers and layers and layers of this title and that title. And the big challenge then is to administer the status quo. That becomes the daily challenge. It becomes operational, not futuristic. The leaders that are in organizations where the leaders involved in the operation rather than in the mission of the future, they're probably in trouble or they're very young. So we'll leave it at that. Well, I've got one more question, but I'm going to open this question up for everybody's input, and certainly that includes the panel. Looking at from economic to cognitive fragility, perhaps the most forward-looking point in the chapter is the shift from economic fragility to cognitive fragility in the age of AI. That is moving from thinking about the public sensitivities to the personal sensitivities, to how what the changes that are underway are just not economic at a global, but they are affecting individuals in the age of AI. If expertise is no longer scarce, what anchors trust, authority, and individual agency now going forward? What risks do we face if we don't address this early? And I see that the courts in the US seem to be addressing it when they've taken on Facebook and Google in New Mexico and California and held them responsible for what they are doing in affecting the personal sovereignty of our youth. So I'm going to open that up. We can go almost anywhere with this now. And I'll look for hands. I'll look for further comments from the panel as well.
Well,
Otherwise,
Perry,
I'm just going to chatter on.
Perry, that's an excellent question. And going back to Jeff, it's absolutely right. The institutions create their own methodology and support system to resist change. But essentially, that's always been based on gatekeeping of knowledge. And as I said before, we in the past have confused knowledge with wisdom. And now that knowledge has become not scarce, but abundant, we have to start thinking about moving knowledge to judgment, not credentials, but capability, not individual output, but coordination, system coordination, about having information versus governing its use. And that's the transition. And this is where I believe these institutions and corporations are starting to struggle because the gatekeepers are losing their power. And so really, it isn't the value in humans is not being lost, it's being repurposed and transitioned to another set. So those that are willing to act and accept consequences become more valuable than those that had simple knowledge. And that's the transition that we're seeing in the economy. So when we talk about the individual, the biggest risk is individuals not understanding the difference between knowledge and wisdom, are turning the computer or the machine into a menu of choices and not really understanding that choices matter. You know, computer does not, or AI does not exist in a mortality mindset. We do. And I'm not talking about the abstract of death. Decisions matter. Choices matter. Some decisions cannot be walked back. There are consequences. And we need to really start focusing on those concepts. And that's where wisdom is it's not so much a wisdom to act, it's a wisdom to not act, challenge assumptions, ask better questions. What are the assumptions that we've assumed here? What are the costs to these assumptions and these decisions? That's where it needs to be moving, and that's where human agency will actually expand and grow.
Right. Can I add to that, though, that you mentioned the importance of judgment, and you also touched on accountability, and that's a really important aspect, is that these systems cannot be accountable. Only humans can be accountable. And I've often talked in these meetings, these webinars, and I've mentioned it with Mel and other conversations about our human tendency towards automation bias. And that is, from a bygone age, that's what we used to assign too much trust to an output from a computer. And now what we've got is what I think was referred to in your article, Perry, as cognitive fragility.
Uh-huh.
It's actually bigger than that. It's cognitive. It's cognitive, not just cognitive fragility. It's cognitive surrender. And I base that on a paper that came out last week from Wharton in university in the States. And I added it to the chat and I'm making it available to everybody. It's based on the work of Kahneman and Tversky, and it's called Thinking Fast, Slow, and Artificial. And they make the case very, very compellingly. It's not just about cognitive fragility, and it's not about developing cognitive resilience. It's recognizing our tendency. Oh, there, you got the book right there, Randall. Good job.
Let me stick this in here. Whoops.
It's recognizing our tendency to surrender because of the fluidity and coherence of the output of these systems. We have to, as Bill said, we have to find our agency in using these tools so that we can accept our accountability, recognize the importance of our judgment and our ethics and our moral position on things, and not abdicate that to the machine because it produces something so amazingly fluent and coherent. And that's a danger. I encourage you. The paper was made a beautiful case for that based on real evidence, and it just came out last week. So anyway, that's my little rant on that subject. Sorry.
Well, it's not a rant at all. In fact, it's sort of embarrassing that organizations of the scope and the size and the influence are so defensive about the impact and the relevance of this new economy emerging. And rather than taking a leadership role, they're probably going to be the last ones out of to be buried, if you will. And I was commenting earlier about an article in the journal today, defensive of the university's mission of academic freedom and maintaining that they should remain independent without influence, even though they're financed publicly, even though they have a mission of civility, discovery, but totally in denial of the impact of this emerging technology, AI, the geopolitical events underway, the social demographics of change, the multicultural nature of the world we live in. And yet they wish to maintain the status quo as they once were. I just don't see it. And they're not alone. I see the professions arguing the same way. Haley, you and I have had talks about probably the first one to be impacted being law, but maybe the last one to change because it's so paper-based. I mean, they're still in a world of paper. They haven't even moved into digital.
Bill, goodness, I feel like I'm just being your fangirl through these weeks when you're everything you say. If I could have found my thumbs up last week, I would have done it too, but I couldn't find it. The judgment. I mean, we're talking about going forward. It's not credentials. It is judgment, but it has to be demonstrated judgment. We have judges currently, this country in the States right now, their judgment capacities are under question, or they should be severely under question. Actual judges sitting in Congress right now, or sitting facing one of the senators, asking them whether Joe Biden legitimately won the election and whether January 6th happened. Judges unable to say their judgment. So when we have that, it's such a I don't know if it's ironic. Certainly, we could expect a different outcome. But when we have judges unable to make judgment, that's when our discerning judgment becomes the most important commodity. Absolutely, the most important commodity. And Jeff, when you're talking about personal agency, that's where it comes in. So it flows from that, and the two leading together. We have outsourced our thinking. We've not just outsourced our knowledge, we have outsourced our capacity to think. And that is fundamentally and uniquely human, not knowledge, but the capacity in how we think, and to form those judgments that are particularly human. So Jeff, Bill, 2 thumbs up. If I can underscore that anymore, I would.
Well, people are feeling overwhelmed, Bill and Haley, to make judgments any longer. And I'm thinking of a conversation I had this morning about parenting. Parents don't feel they can do parenting anymore. The educational system having so much influence, the Facebook having so much influence that an individual who is counseling a family said they've got to put the cell phone away they got to either take it away or get their son to learn to put that cell phone away. The parent can't do it anymore. They feel absolutely overwhelmed by the child. The child is running the family. The parent doesn't feel they have adequate control to make judgment. They're terrified if they take the cell phone away because the kid will overreact. They cannot compete as parents with a cell phone. That's what California and New Mexico were holding Meta accountable, and Google, that seem to know that. Go ahead, Peter.
I just wanted to add to the conversation about the issues about jobs and AI in particular. I've said on this AI network before, but I'd certainly like to repeat it again because it's rarely said enough, in my view. We hear a lot about ethics and these disruptive technologies, ethics this, ethics that. Yet ethics is a cultural phenomenon, and it varies with cultures across the world. And so, how does this so-called AI, artificial intelligence, know where it is in the world to invoke what ethics is appropriate? So I think what's really more important, I mean, ethics is certainly important. I'm not discounting it. But I think what's more important to get it right in terms of how the products work as they should, intended to work, is to ensure that the developers, that's the mission critical, the major developers, those up the chain, including those who are coding, and coding, of course, is something that AI is taking over. But nonetheless, the people who do the design and coding and testing, as well as those who operate these systems in mission critical environments, should all be certified in some degree with their integrity, because either you have it or you don't. It's simple as that. And so it gets over the ethics issue in an instant. And I challenge, how many of you have ever, in an employment situation, either as a person hiring or being, interviewed for employment, have ever been asked about your ethics and your integrity? And I would wager probably not any one of you, or at least if it is, it'd be maybe one or two.
Well,
I've
Peter,
asked this
Peter,
question several times, and nobody's ever got an answer that says, yes, I have.
but Peter,
Yet they go away saying they should.
Peter, most professions do now have an ethical assessment in order to be certified. The question is whether or not they abide by that ethic once they become practitioners, and that ethic is "Thou shalt do no harm."
Well, this is the integrity. This is the little whisper on your shoulder saying, no, don't do that. It's wrong.
So, how many professions should be decertified because they still have not been able to have adequate influence over the practitioners to ensure that ethics are being practiced? Not one teacher has been fired in BC or in Alberta in the history of the Alberta Teacher or BC Teachers Association. You can't tell me that you have 100% no errors. Anyway,
Well, I would totally agree
whole
with that,
other
especially when it comes to politics.
yeah. Well, I talk about decertification. I think if there's anything that we may well be able to look forward to is ultimately recognizing that the structural infrastructure that has been built around the knowledge economy has impeded the very intent of that economy to empower the client as opposed to empowering the suppliers. That's
Just
a
one
mouth.
other thing I might just add, and I can put it in the chat if you're interested. But over a year ago, Ellie Fahy and I wrote an op-ed for Research Money on AI and how it could dumb us down. And we were quite serious about this potential. And we're starting to hear a lot more people talking about this idea that AI may be just dumbing us down. I'm not everyone, of course, but you know, think about the hoi polloi or I think we're going to see a dependency on it like we saw an absolutely remarkable transition from, doing arithmetic with pencil and paper to using a calculator.
Yeah.
And people started not even asking questions about the answer. As long as they put the numbers in, they thought they were putting in, but put in an extra zero or whatever. They didn't ask questions about the answer. It's
Okay,
just like
Yeah.
we have these problems in so many things.
But
so
that's at least that's a binary output, right? At
Yes,
least
well, that's true.
at least
So
that's
is integrity. So is integrity. It's binary.
so as the age of faith came to an end and people gave up on prayer, and so the age of the knowledge economy comes to an end and people dumb down, what will they be doing in the future? I'm not gonna play the game. I'm gonna challenge that for a moment. So let's say they do dumb down. They don't learn to wash dishes anymore. They have a dishwasher.
Mhm.
They don't learn to memorize anymore. They have a ChatGPT or they have an OpenAI. So let's assume for a moment that this is a consequence of bringing new technology in. What will displace it? What will the human mind or the brain be used for if it's not for memory?
So that's a great question, Perry. So when we got these tools as the dishwasher or the calculator, it instead of having value of using a slide rule or a piece of paper, the value was utilizing the answer the calculator provided, or as far as the dishwasher, to free up the time to do something more valuable than simply scrubbing a piece of porcelain.
Right.
And so we have to take a look at these tools on not that they've replaced something valued, but the value moved to something else. And
Right.
this is what we're going to see within AI. We've valued knowledge very highly, hence the gatekeepers of knowledge, such as lawyers and accountants, where the knowledge of the law is external to the common person. Knowledge of how to manufacture numbers in a spreadsheet, external to the common person. So we were stopped in that understanding of what they were, and there was great value in that knowledge. Now that's gone. The value doesn't disappear, it moves to something more important. And as I said before, it moves more important to judgment. So you talked about the parent and the Facebook problem. But the problem is the parent has outsourced their daycare to the state and external sources, and then they outsource the education and socialization of the children to schools and other things. And then they become surprised that they have no value or no input on their children's lives when they're at home. They've outsourced everything else. And so it isn't the it isn't a it is the reaping of the consequences of the avoidance of responsibility. And so we talk about how we're going to go in the future. Those that want to outsource the responsibility to a menu item that the machine produces will, in the long term, have very high negative outcomes.
Mhm.
Those that use the machine to create choices and then choose, knowing the consequences, will, in the long run, get great value from the machine. And
And
I think
that's what we have called personal sovereignty. You're bang on. Peter, I'm going to give you not the last word, but I want you to respond to that because what Bill has opened up is that yes, we can become dependent or we can take this tool and move on and recognize that the knowledge is now there. How do we use that as opposed to become dependent and retarded, if you will?
Well, first off, thank you, and I totally agree with Bill and everything he said in that comment stream. How we make use of it in the future, that's a wide open question. That's, I think the only way we're going to get it, even having any concept of that idea, is to develop scenarios. And of course, we don't necessarily develop the right scenario.
Yeah.
But I think we need to think out of the box, so to speak, in a variety of different ways with a wide mix of individuals from backgrounds of social science, hard science, literature, arts, etc. I mean, I think it's really important.
But you've
And then
elevated
engaging certain citizens who might be interested as well.
you've elevated that discussion to a public level. I want to keep it at the personal level. What should we be doing with our children? What should we be doing as individuals to ensure that we have personal sovereignty in order to introduce what the future should be, as opposed to having some scenarios built by some government someplace like WEF that does its little scenario planning and comes back to us and says, we found the answer. I was seeing some data today of how many governments have become more autocratic in this period of rapid change and uncertainty, of saying people are seeking certainty. Well, they're not seeking certainty from self. They're going to government seeking certainty. You talk about having achieved a level of dependency. We've got people walking around asking government what it can do for me, as opposed to what I can do for myself and my family and my kids. I was talking to someone this morning about education should be honest to parents. We are not fulfilling your expectations. We cannot educate your children as you once saw them being educated any longer. We are failing. Your kids are failing. They're getting 30s, not 85s, which we put on their report card because we need to move them on. They are getting 30s. And next year, when you see 30s, don't tell us that we were lying. That is the way the system's working right now.
Yeah, there's now at least two generations of young people who cannot do cursive writing, and so they can't even write a love letter.
Those are symptomatic of how significant the problem has become. The educational system is not delivering, and yet we as a society have come to believe that it is the foundation for both a civil society, a productive society, all of what we have expected in the past coming from it. Education is not delivering. And I'm not sure the system as it exists today can, because it's not teaching learning. It's still about memorization and facts.
Well, university is more about learning, but I would suggest that some of the general programmed courses that are set out by the provincial governments are very much about just learning facts.
That's the professional schools that are giving you certification. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. I don't know, Dawn or Jeff, who wants to go first? Okay, we'll go. Let the guy go first, because we've been letting women go first for way too long. Go ahead, Jeff.
Just to echo your point about the education system. So like a lot of thinkers like Peter Diamandis are saying, they're questioning whether it's even a good idea for their children to go to university, because what they're going to be receiving, basically just a document, doesn't compare to what's already available in terms of the AI. But historically, over the last 100 years or so, there's something called the Flynn effect, which we've seen IQs increasing every decade. But I think that is probably going to change in the near future. Political discourse since the 1980s has been less intellectual, particularly in presidential debates. So they're appealing to the lowest common denominator. And we may end up in a society kind of like what's in the movie I, Robot, based on the Asimov book, where basically the robots are babysitting us, and we aren't making our own decisions, and because of that we lose freedom. So one of the consequences I think we're seeing is that relationships are failing. The population of South Korea is imploding because women don't want to have relationships with men, and vice versa. Or we have this whole group of I guess the traditional Korean values where the male is dominant and stuff in an educated society don't fit anymore. So I shouldn't say that women don't want to have a relationship with men. That's maybe imposing something that isn't there. But the point is that the men aren't stepping up to the level that the women want to have relationships with them. Maybe should say it that way. So yeah, consequences, and that's declining birth rate and society falling apart. And how much of that is because of children looking at phone screens or computer screens? I don't know, but
Well, how much of that is a product of the dependency of the individual on the public systems? Like we have lived now since World War II in the emergence of the welfare state. And the welfare state made promises that it could do so many things for you. And as a consequence, people have stepped back and said, I expect you now to take care of my health, my education, my welfare, you name it. And people complaining today go to government first to do their complaining.
but that's only going to get worse, I think, because as we have more abundance and we see this K economy where we have the concentration of wealth and poorer people, either you let the poor people starve, or you're going to have some sort of public system that keeps them alive somehow or another.
Well, but that public system, I don't think will be. I think that public system will collapse. The trust in the public system, both too much trust, inability to move quickly. The illusion of permanence is what you're responding to, is somehow we believe that government as it has been, regardless of debt and regardless of trust, will continue. I don't think it will. And that takes you back to the relevance and the critical importance of personal sovereignty in the world that we're in and going further into. I see you're nodding your head, Jeff. Go ahead, Dawn.
I was just wanting to go back to the parenting discussion and outsourcing, that to others, and what consequences are you going to get? Why don't we ask ourselves, what kind of parents are we? I mean, are we observing our kids? Are we talking to them, playing with them, teaching them, helping them with their homework?
All right.
Are we engaged with them? Are we really listening? Because you do these things and you really get to know who your kids are. But if you outsource it, you're going to miss out on all of that, aren't you?
Okay,
And
but
similarly, as they get older, get involved and get engaged and make your opinions known. Let's say when you're interacting with the education system, which has quite a bit of influence over them. But I don't think as parents we should just sit back and become complacent. I mean, I think our active involvement and our active listening will probably put us in a good place with those kids that we have. I think it's people have got to wake up and don't be lazy.
have you ever sat down, Dawn, and tried to confront the education system or City Hall today and expect that the individual parent who doesn't know the new math and is having
Yeah,
difficulty teaching their kids and is being
yeah.
told to get out of the way, the education system will make the decisions regarding the gender of your child, for example,
Oh, I know. Yeah.
and on it goes. I mean, I think what you're articulating is the world that you and I grew up in. That's not the world of today. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah. So for me, just to put a point on it, AI is making intelligence abundant, but it doesn't eliminate the responsibility. And it actually makes responsibility even more valuable going into the future.
Yeah.
And so really getting back to your topic here, the last commons might not be land or resources. It just might be human judgment itself.
The last commons, Jeff, has as three words: reclaiming personal sovereignty. Reclaiming is the word. Dawn, our parents today still think that the world is there for them. They have to take it back. That takes an active initiative on their part to believe that it is their role, not the school's role, to raise their child. The school is a partner, an adjunct, but they have taken control to the extent that the parents believe that the education system is responsible for educating their child. The government is responsible for their health care, regardless of what they eat or what they smoke or how they live. We have given up in the welfare state our personal sovereignty. What the book is about is reclaiming that.
Well,
Jeff?
Yep.
Sorry, Dawn. Go ahead, Jeff, and then Dawn.
Can I just say on the parenting question, I think those are legitimate factors to be concerned about, Perry, what's been you just mentioned and what Dawn discussed. I think there's another piece to this that's maybe as important, if not more important, and that is the abdication of parents to relinquish that responsibility on the part of their children. And I saw this with a couple that I know that have moved to Calgary. I lived in the same building as them many 6 years ago. They had children, and they brought their toddler and stayed with us once, and they had that child at 2 years old in a playpen in our sunroom, and that child never was outside of a screen with YouTube on it. And I've seen this in restaurants with kids nowadays. They bring the phone or they bring an iPad that's propped up in front of the child. And so if parents, and by the way, parents are also guilty of this because in many cases and I'll even say we are addicted to these devices as well. So it's hard for us to take our children to task if we ourselves are too much on our phones and devices. So I think it's a parental responsibility and not just expecting too much of government or of the educational system. I think parents themselves have abdicated that responsibility, and they can reclaim that with their kids. They're sometimes, like you said in the opening, Perry, just too chicken to do it, just too chicken to confront their child and not let them have a cell phone or an iPad. My son in Vancouver controls access to the iPad for my granddaughter very strenuously, and it is not easy. And she won't have a cell phone until she's 16. The other comment I was going to make quickly is just Peter mentioned about ethics being situational or cultural. I think this is why, Bill, and Peter, you're seeing conversation about sovereign AI. China has sovereign AI. The country where I lived in the UAE for 6.5 years, they have an AI program called Falcon, and it is their sovereign AI. The US, you see the Department of War influencing the AI being produced by private companies now with their challenge to Anthropic. So the US has a form of sovereign AI, right? In China, you can't ask an AI about Tiananmen Square.
Right.
In the UAE, there are religious restrictions. It's a Muslim country. It's a theocracy. So you're going to see and hear more about that. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, 2 years ago said this is one of the most important areas for development of AI, and that is sovereign AI. Not only because it serves his financial interests, but because countries need to be in a position to maintain their own national sovereignty. And one of the ways you do that is by controlling what your citizens have access to. I don't know if they can do it, but it's an interesting question.
Well, something I was involved in the late 90s. It was an OECD workshop, international workshop hosted by Statistics Canada and sponsored sponsored by the OECD, with a team of people who were being posed a simple question: what should we measure in the national accounts with respect to the digital economy? Well, here we are 26 years later, and we still don't measure anything. It's part of the digital economy per se. I mean, yes, we get quotes about, oh, e-commerce is this big, and, people are making sales of, like software as a service now is done through the internet. So there's no particular product that flows, it's a service. But so there's some things we know about, but we don't have an aggregate statistical way of knowing actually the nature of our digital economy. And
Well,
it's as a consequence, it's even harder to make policy as a result of that. I mean, we can throw darts at the board, but
Well,
I think it's
let's take a shot at that, Peter. Let's step back for a moment and think about let's say the last 100 years, and let's take a look at some metrics about where has power gone from. We were once a pioneer society where the individual needed to be responsible for their family and their food, and if they didn't do it well, they starved to death. What has happened in the last 100 years is we have given up personal sovereignty in the belief that the municipal government, the regional government, the provincial government, the federal government is going to do it for us. And now all of the tension is between levels of government and to who's got responsibility for us anymore. We're irrelevant. The individual has become irrelevant to the various systems that have been built on top of the individual, always in the offer of that four-letter word, we are here to help you. We are here to make you dependent. And it is a unintended consequence of help is dependency. Go ahead, Vlad.
Yeah, I had to speak up because I mean, I had three kids and I was a teacher since 1972. So I seen a lot, you know, and in our education system, like the Canadian one is very good. We always beat the Americans. Like I was also part of the American Association of Physics Teachers, and they die for our exams, you know, that we have in Alberta in physics, compared to we make them think. So it's our education system is good, the public system, you know, like in Canada for sure, and I'm sure in Europe too, it's very good because we've developed a lot of people that you know did very well. So it's
So,
not
so
that, but you're right about. Sorry, I just want to finish
yeah.
up. They are, but you're right. The parents is very important. The basics, it's the parents, and the parents should always be with the kids, making sure that they bring up, you know, properly, and you know, and be caring, like you were saying, like all of you were saying about caring and about following them and teaching them whatever they can, you know, and they feel then it comes down to the kids are secure in their home and with the parents and they'll come. My kids actually they started some of them with the computers, the Mac, you know, because my kid my son is 80 in 1989 he was born, and now he's a doctor, he's a specialist in Phoenix right now, but he used the computers and that. And my other son the same thing, you know, he's a
That's a darn good question.
yes.
But Vlad, I mean, with all respect to what you as an individual have
Yes.
experienced, both as a teacher and as a parent, we have a large percentage of kids graduating from schools, going to university without being able to read. How do you explain that?
Well, that's because a lot of people did not, they neglected them. The parents must have neglected them.
So why did the schools move them on?
Well, part of the reason is from what I've seen, also my experience is that they move them up. They don't want to, like especially in the junior high, what they do is they actually give them extra mark. They don't want to keep them back.
So
And that's bad.
who are the sys, who is
Well,
that,
it's the
who are they responsible to then?
Well, the principal should be doing something, you know, and also, you know, the school board. They don't want to get, you know, the parents to complain or anything like that. So what they do is they put them in different categories, you know, like the weaker part and that, but they keep moving them. And also there was the belief that if the kid does not move, then he feels bad. He feels out of place and all that. But
Oh, so it's feelings. This is
yeah, but
Freud.
that
Thank you to Sigmund Freud. He has helped us in the 20th century to make sure that
yeah.
the suppliers are in charge, not the client anymore. We want to make sure the suppliers feel good.
But that's wrong, you see, and we know that. Like I know I was a
Well,
principal
if we
at
know
the
that, why aren't we acting on that?
well, we have. I mean, whenever I could, anywhere I had power, I did something about it, you
Yeah,
see.
what happened to the school system that gave the kids zeros?
Well, we had that argument just about 20 years ago,
And who
25 years
won?
ago.
And who won?
Well, no, there was a big fight. The teachers really fought those, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my point exactly. Okay, we are right at bewitching hour. This has been 1 hour of incredible insight and excitement. Bill, Haley, Dawn, Jeff, you lit a lot of fires today.